Thank you all for being here. My name is Ben Marcus, so I'll introduce myself. I am the Religious Literacy Specialist at the Religious Freedom Center, which is part of the Freedom Forum. We are a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. We're nonpartisan, so we don't align with any particular political group or political community. We're non-sectarian, so we don't receive government funding and we don't receive funding from any particular religious community. We're really a non-sectarian organization that's dedicated to educating the public about the history, meaning, and significance of the religious liberty clauses of the First Amendment. So I primarily lead our educators track. I work with a lot of K-12 educators and higher ed educators who are interested in teaching about religion in academically rigorous and constitutionally appropriate ways. My background is in religious studies, so the academic study of religion. I have an undergraduate and master's degree in religious studies, and my focus is in the subfield of religious literacy education. So how do we bring the tools, the disciplinary concepts and tools of religious studies to different kinds of audiences, whether that's educators, religious and civic leaders, political leaders, business people, or others. So that's my background. I'm calling in today from the Chicagoland area. I'm at my parents' home for quarantine, and usually I live in Washington, D.C., but this fall, COVID permitting, I'll be starting a law school program at Yale Law School. So that's my background, is mostly in religious studies with a strong interest in law as well. So today, what I'll be talking about, I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Is religious literacy and community engagement. So one thing that I would like to start with is just setting some of the context, thinking about what's going on with the religious landscape in the United States today. So this is an interactive part of the presentation. So my question to you is, what do you think is going on with the religious landscape? How do you think it might be changing or staying the same? So feel free to type in your comments into the chat, or you can unmute your microphone.
Well, I would say.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Katrina.
I was just going to say, I'm a homeschooler, and in the homeschooling community, we see a real divide between people who are extremely religious and only interested in that point of view, and people who are extremely open and interested in no particular religious point of view.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So a divide or polarization, and we will look at some data about polarization on different kinds of lines, political, religious, and otherwise. So that's an important point. Thank you for bringing that up. I see someone in the chat wrote that the US is becoming more diverse, less organized, and more polarized. So again, the polarization, but we will also talk about increasing religious diversity in the United States. And someone else, Brenda, mentioned that it's becoming more religiously diverse, but we're experiencing more Christian pushback. And again, that's something that we'll look at. So these are all really, really helpful insights. And then a couple other comments about an increase in the number of non-religious communities, less interest in religion practice, more nuns. So those are all absolutely correct. Those are in line with what we're seeing, and I'll show you some data and then hopefully provide some nuance to that data as well. So there is an organization called the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, that's considered one of the top organizations in the United States that's conducting public opinion polling about religion, looking at religious affiliation in the United States. And they released a major sort of landmark study in 2016 called America's Changing Religious Identity, and they looked at how the religious landscape of the United States is changing. And they found a few big things. One is that white Christians account for less than 50% of the population. So for the first time in US history, people who are both white and Christian, that the share of the population that is both white and Christian is less than 50%, it's a minority. And that's coming at around the same time as there was a shift in demographics so that Protestant Christians of all different races and ethnicities are less than 50% of the population. So we're really entering this new chapter in the story of religion in America. We're no longer a majority Protestant Christian country, and we're no longer a majority white Christian country. We are becoming increasingly religiously diverse. Often when we hear about this increasing diversity and the decrease in the white Christian population, we hear about it in the context of white mainline Protestants, but it's important to point out that this decrease in affiliation is also happening with white evangelical Protestants and white Catholics. So we're seeing this decrease in different kinds of white Christian communities in terms of percentage of population. At the same time, we're seeing an increase in religious diversity. So we're seeing more Americans who are identifying as Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, and Sikh, for example, that those communities are growing as a share of the American population. And then, as some of you mentioned, we're seeing this increase in the nones, N-O-N-E-S. So when they're asked on a survey to self-identify, they'll say that they are none, they don't belong to a religious community, that there's this increase in the percentage of nones in the United States. But what we should keep in mind is that none does not necessarily mean atheist or agnostic. In fact, the majority of those who are religiously unaffiliated would not self-identify as atheist and agnostic. They might say that they're spiritual but not religious, that they believe in God but they don't belong to a specific religious community. So this is one thing to keep in mind when we think about this percentage of the population that's unaffiliated. So with all that in mind, what percentage of the population do you think is Jewish? I saw someone say something, but I couldn't hear. You just throw out a number. I see someone say 4%, 5%, less than 1%, 10%.
2%.
Great. Okay, so we see a range, right? A relatively sizable range. And what percentage of the population do you think is Muslim? See, Jordan said small. 7, 9, 1. Okay, so we see somewhat similar ranges for Jewish and Muslim. So this is, I think, a very interesting question to ask. And of course, it does vary. I'm talking about national statistics. It does depend if, in certain states or in certain towns, it might be much bigger or much smaller. But there was a study by Pew that found that Americans consistently overestimate the percentage of the population that is Jewish or Muslim. So the actual numbers are in this next slide. So about 2% of the population is Jewish, about 1% of the population is Muslim, and 1% or less are Hindu, Buddhist, and Sikh. So these are very small percentages of the population overall. So even though white Christians account for less than 50% of the population, Christians as a whole of all different races and ethnicities, of all denominations, are still more than 50%. But these blue colors show you that white Christians are significantly less than 50%. The green colors are generally Christians of color. And then those orange colors are others, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and Sikhs and others. That pink wedge represents this new interesting chapter in the story of religion in America. 24% of the population in 2016 identified as unaffiliated or didn't identify with a particular religious community. So even though the percentage of the population that is Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, and Muslim is growing, it still accounts for a small percentage of the overall population. That said, even though it's a small percentage of the population, it's growing dramatically. So there are now 7 times more Muslims, 10 times more Buddhists, 9 times more Hindus, and 220 times more Sikhs than in 1970. And when Vince Perillo wrote that was actually about a decade ago. So there are even more Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and Sikhs than in 1970. Does anyone remember back to their high school US history classes, what happened in the 60s that led to this change? It's okay. I know it was a long time ago taking those classes. So what happened is changes in immigration law. Immigration law changed and allowed for more folks to come to the United States from East and South Asia. And so obviously not all Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and Sikhs are East or South Asian. But as we allowed more people to come to this country from those parts of the world, which are historically larger percentages of the population from these different religious communities, we also saw the religious landscape of the United States change as well. I think it's also interesting to break it down by age group. So you probably can't actually read the key in this infographic. That's okay. I just want you to look at the colors. So on the far left, on the left graphic, America the Diverse, on the far left, you see 18 to 29-year-olds, then 30 to 49, then 50 to 64, and then 65 plus. So as you go right, it gets to the older age groups. So what do you think? This is showing religious affiliation age group. What do you think the green color represents?
I'm guessing that it represents the amount of people that identify as unaffiliated.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. So 65 plus, about 11% of people, Americans 65 plus are unaffiliated. 31% of Americans 18 to 29 are unaffiliated. So that's a 20-point change in age bands. Some people ask at this point whether it's just a function of age, whether as people get older, they will get more religious. So we'll see this, you know, today's 18 to 29-year-olds will be more religious than they were now when they're 65. The answer is a bit complicated. We might see some reaffiliation, but if you were to rewind today's 65-year-olds to when they were 18 to 29, they weren't as unaffiliated then as today's 18 to 29-year-olds are. So we think that this will, we're seeing a longer term trend toward disaffiliation. And then what about those blue colors that you see in the graphic? What do you think those blue colors represent?
I think
Jay
they're
is
probably
Christian.
denominations.
Sorry, say that one more time.
Christian denominations.
Christian denominations. Yeah. Do you have a qualifier for that? So a certain kind of Christian, mainline. And it's actually white Christians. Yeah. So the blue colors are white Christians. If you look at the 65 plus, it's a clear majority of Americans are both white and Christian. And in the 18 to 29 age group, it's a clear minority of Americans are both white and Christian. So the reason why we look at race and religion together often in these kinds of demographic data is because it shows us some interesting different trends. So historically, Black Protestant churches vote in different ways. They often worship in different ways. They often have different kinds of denominational histories than white mainline Protestant churches, for example. Same thing with Hispanic Catholics and white Catholics. So we'll see in just a moment how if you take into account both race and religion, we see different kinds of trends. That's the reason why we're breaking out the data that way. And then on the right, you'll see this graphic, American Values Atlas. This is actually just a screenshot of an interactive map that you can look at online. It's free. So I clicked on Wyoming just to show you Wyoming. It breaks out the religious affiliation of Wyoming. You can do it for any state, and then you can also sort of cross-examine the religious affiliation with other kinds of political views, views on LGBT issues, views on immigration, et cetera. So it's a fun little graphic that you can use to look at Wyoming and explore your state. Can I make it larger? I can if I do this. Did that work on your screen? Yeah, great. So Wyoming, it says 16% white evangelical Protestant, 17% white mainline Protestant, less than 0.5% Black Protestant, 4% Mormon. So obviously this is 1% Jewish, so slightly smaller Jewish population than the rest of the country, slightly larger population of others than other parts of the country. So there are some questions about this graph. I can send you this whole slide deck. Well, first of all, you'll have the recording of the slide deck and this presentation, and then I can also send Jordan a recording of the presentation and the PDF of the slides so that you can use this in the future. So another way to break out the data, this is, sorry, I'm seeing a question. Are Mormons or LDS considered Christian for this data? It's broken out separately, so they don't take a particular stand. It is color-coded similarly to other kinds of white Christians. You'll see LDS is blue, which is along the lines of other kinds of white Christian denominations. It's, later, perhaps we can have a conversation about the limitations of infographics and how they're not able to capture nuance particularly well, but that's how PRRI chose to break it out. So this one shows differences in white Christian percentages by state. So I think this one's really dramatic and interesting to look at. This is from 2007 to 2016. And it shows the change in percentage of the population of each state that identifies as both white and Christian. So I'm speaking outside of Chicago, I grew up in the Midwest. I think there's sometimes a perception in the middle of the country that that there are the godless coasts, but the middle of the country are still predominantly white Christian and are not as affected by some of these demographic changes. And that's actually not the case. So I'm speaking to you from Illinois. In 2007, 56% of the population was both white and Christian. In Illinois in 2016, 42% of the population. So that's a 14-point change in just 9 years. Wyoming, there's a sort of slight caveat to the data, which is in 2007, it was the only state that they had a small enough sample size that they weren't highly confident in the numbers. But they did say that in Wyoming, there were 70% roughly white and Christian in 2007. And then in 2016, when they had better data, they said 57%. So the important thing here is that in every state in the country, there was a decline in the percentage of the population that is both white and Christian. And in the vast majority of the states, if not all of the states, it was a double-digit decline. So we're seeing a really dramatic shift in the religious landscape of the country. And then one more piece on the changing religious landscape. This is about party affiliation by religious affiliation. So again, just to highlight why we look at both race or ethnicity and religion, I think this gives you a good idea. So white Catholics, for example, 34% vote or would say that they're members of the Republican Party, 35% independent, and 26% Democrat. Hispanic Catholics, though, it's very different, 9% Republican, 38% independent, and 40% Democrat. So we see that there are, one of the important things to keep in mind when we think about religion in the United States is to not just look at religious affiliation. Religious people and religious communities don't just exist in a vacuum. They exist in particular social and cultural contexts. And so a lot of the work that we do at the Religious Freedom Center is help people understand the complexity of the interaction between religious identity and other kinds of identity. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. I had a professor in graduate school who was very fond of saying that if you want to know who people will vote for in the country, you can reliably guess if you have 4 pieces of information. If you know their religious affiliation, if you know their race, if you know their rank, socioeconomic rank, and you know their region of the country that they're from. So region, race, rank, and religion. And so this data, I think, gives you a sense of that white evangelical Protestants, for example, have different kinds of voting patterns than Unitarian Universalists on the other end of the spectrum. And then if you add in race, region, and rank into this, it gives you a pretty good sense of people's voting patterns. And there are reasons for that again, we'll talk about in just a moment. And then the final thing I want to say, demographics-wise, the final piece of data is about changes in what it means to be religious. So I just use same-sex marriage as an example, but you can pull out different kinds of social issues. What this is meant to illustrate is that people who identify as a member of a particular religious community, what that means has changed over time. So this is really dramatic because it's showing just 4 years how much what it means to be religious has changed in the United States from 2013 to 2017. So on the left, you see a graphic that shows opposition to same-sex marriage in historically conservative religious groups. And you can see that in each of these historically conservative religious groups, there's been a double-digit decrease in opposition to same-sex marriage. So for example, white evangelical Protestants, 71% opposed same-sex marriage in 2013, 58% opposed it in 2017. Hispanic Protestants, we saw a change from a majority to a minority. 65% opposed it in 2013, only 45% opposed it in 2017. And that's really dramatic. That's a 20-point change in 4 years. So what it means to be religious in the United States is changing. And then on the right, you see gaps by age group. So you'll see that there are these huge gaps between those who are 18 to 29 and those who are 65 plus in their support of same-sex marriage, who favor allowing gay and lesbian couples to marry legally. So a recap of this section, the religious landscape is changing dramatically. We're seeing no longer a majority white Christian country, no longer a majority Protestant Christian country, an increase in the percentage of the population that is Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, or Sikh, even though they're relatively small percentages of the population. We're seeing decreases in white Christian presence across the country in different regions and states. We're seeing a change in what it means to be religious. So that's the context in which we live. That's what is happening in terms of the changing religious landscape. So why promote religious literacy? Well, part of it has to do with another trend that we're seeing that I haven't yet covered, which is about hate crimes. So unfortunately, in the past 5-6 years, we've seen a general increase in religion-related hate crimes in the United States. And so you can choose different organizations that track this data. I'll show you the FBI data, which is seen as most conservative in its estimate. But then there are other groups like ISPU specifically looks at Muslim hate crimes against Muslims. ADL looks at different kinds of hate crimes, especially against Jews. Hindu American Foundation against Hindus. SPLC looks at different kinds of hate groups. So they all have different numbers, in part because they have different reporting systems, different ways of defining hate crimes, but they agree on a trend. And unfortunately, that trend is overall an increase. So I guess I already showed the slide, so it's too late. But sometimes I ask people what they think, who are the most frequent targets of religion-related hate crimes? And often I get the answer of Muslims, and certainly Muslims are a frequent target of religion-related hate crimes, the second most frequent. But anti-Jewish hate crimes still today continue to be the most prevalent form of religion-related hate crimes in the United States. So we sometimes tell ourselves a myth that America has escaped the scourge of anti-Semitism in the US, and that's just not the case. So we see this increase from 2014 to 2017 in anti-Jewish hate crimes, a slight decline in 2018. And then we see this increase from 2014 to 2016 in anti-Muslim hate crimes, and then a slight decline in 2017, 2018. So there are some fluctuations here. Overall, we're seeing this long-term increase. Sometimes the people suspect that there are increases in hate crimes against Jews and Muslims when there are acts of violence committed by Jews or Muslims in the name of their religious communities. But actually, the more and that is sometimes the case. So after 9/11, for example, we saw this huge spike, 1,600% spike in anti-Muslim hate crimes in the US. But the more reliable predictor of increases in hate crimes against these minority communities is during election years. So there have been some studies that show that during election years, some politicians will mobilize their base by appealing to latent hatred against certain minority religious communities. So this is something to be aware of now that we're in an election year, 2020. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Obviously with COVID, everyone staying at home, there's a lot that will change, but this is something to be aware of. The reason why we think religious literacy is important is because we operate under the hypothesis that teaching about religion can decrease the bigotry and prejudice that fuel violence. That is not something that we just came up with, although we feel it very strongly. It's also the operating hypothesis of the American Academy of Religion. And the AAR is considered the largest and best professional association for scholars who study religion in the world. And in 2010, they came out with these guidelines for teaching about religion, and they said up front that their hypothesis is that teaching about religion can decrease the bigotry and prejudice that fuel violence. The good news for us is that there seems to be some data that shows that that's the case. So in the entire country, the only district that we know of that requires all students to take a standalone religious studies course before they graduate is in Modesto, California. And Modesto is not San Francisco, this is not LA. Modesto is a very conservative part of California. And because it's the only one, there was a great deal of interest by scholars in what was happening there and what the outcomes of that education were. And what they found is that students who went through this religious studies program did not become more or less religious, significantly more or less religious, but they did become more likely to respect the rights of others, including those with whom they strongly disagree. So we see that at the RFC as very, very good news, because as First Amendment advocates and as religious literacy advocates, if we were to teach about religion in public schools in a way that's changing students' religious identity, that's making them all Christian or all Muslim or all atheist, we would see that as a violation of the Establishment Clause, that certainly wouldn't be appropriate if the goal of religious studies education or the primary effect was a significant change in religious identity. What we did find is that they're more likely to respect the rights of others. And so for us, that's what we find, that's what we think is very, very important. And there are actually now, as of 2017, national guidelines that were published by the mainstream social studies education organization in the country, NCSS. And those guidelines try to adhere to the best practices, which advocate for teaching about religion in these academically rigorous and constitutionally appropriate ways. So I'll pause there. The next section is about what is religious literacy. We'll define it, we'll provide a framework, and then we'll have an activity that's interactive talking about our own religious identities. But at this halfway point, I just wanted to stop and ask if there are any questions.
I'm gonna have to leave you.
Okay.
Sorry. I am a pastor and something's come up, so
No worries.
thank you for this. It's really wonderful work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for joining. And we will have a recording, so we can share that with you. And if you have any questions, I'm available. This is my full-time job, is to be a support to folks like you all. So if you want to reach out, Jordan has my email address, or I can just tell you now, it's bmarcus, MARCUS, @freedomforum.org. So you also should have that email address in the Zoom registration link that you got, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks a million, Benjamin.
Yeah, thank you.
So Ben, I have a question. So with Grace Davies' believing without belonging and belonging without believing,
yeah,
of course we cannot suss that out with, well, some of it you can, I guess, with data, right?
Yeah.
But I found it interesting when it came to Wyoming, there were 30% unaffiliated. And that felt high to me based on my experience of Wyoming, but I'm guessing that's increasing proportionally just as it is nationally. I wonder whether some of those unaffiliated, right, are believing without belonging.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you can address that whole question.
In the while that I've been doing this, you're the first person to bring up Grace Davy. I love that you brought up Grace Davy. It makes me very happy. We'll actually talk about that in just a moment. That's like the whole rest of the presentation is talking about that concept. But yeah, I would remind us all that the unaffiliated, what PRRI tells us from their data, that the majority of people who are unaffiliated are not atheist or agnostic, that they're people who might believe in God. So they had some follow-up questions about belief in God, about different kinds of spiritual or theological views. So it is certainly possible that in Wyoming that the trend would match, that a majority of people in Wyoming would be folks who might be believing without belonging, but I would have to go look at the data to verify that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other? Oh, I see a question in the chat. So there was a question, has your program been able to continue through online K-12 programs? Yes, so this is one example of a kind of virtual program that we do. We offer a number of different webinars over the next couple of weeks. I'm speaking with a synagogue in New Jersey. Tomorrow, I'm speaking with the Tri-Faith Initiative in Nebraska. Next week, I believe, I was speaking with a classroom in Pennsylvania last week or so. So we are still offering these kinds of online programs while people are quarantining. So if you know of any schools or people or other religious communities that might be interested in this kind of program, I'd be happy to speak with you offline or just on email about that possibility as well. Yep. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll move on to the second part of the presentation. So that was a really great segue. Sorry, I missed your name. You just asked about the believing without belonging. So we'll talk about that next. In 2010, Pew, which is another, with PRRI, Pew is the sort of other main group that does public opinion polling about religion. They did a religious knowledge survey. And they asked 32 questions that were intended to be representative of a body of important knowledge about religion. And on average, Americans could only answer 16 of those questions correctly. There was a lot made of this in the news. You know, these kinds of headlines read something along the lines of, Americans are religious, but they don't know anything about religion, or they're hypocrite, right? So saying that Americans can't do, they fare poorly on this religious knowledge survey. And what's even more interesting is if you compare the results by religious community with another metric. So there was another survey conducted by other scholars looking at religiosity called the Religiosity Index, or the Faith Matters survey. And in that survey, they asked a series of questions to try to identify how important religion was in the lives of people. So a high religiosity index score meant religion was very important in their daily lives, and a low religiosity index score meant it wasn't very important. So if you compare that religiosity index with the Pew survey, what you find is that some of the religious communities for which religious identity is very important, they didn't do very well on the survey. So for example, Black Protestants score very high on the religiosity index, but didn't score very well on the Pew survey. Or on the other end of the spectrum, Jews and atheists, for whom who had very low scores on the religiosity index, did very well on this survey. So rather than saying that Americans are hypocrites or that religious people don't know anything about religion, many scholars in the religious studies community took a step back and asked what it means on a survey when we say that religious people don't know about religion. That are we asking the right kinds of questions on that survey? Are we really getting at the right kinds of things that a religious person would know about religion? So by way of an analogy, here's the analogy. Like I said, I'm speaking to you from outside Chicago in the northwestern suburbs. The school that I went to, the public high school that I went to, was considered a majority minority school. It was a majority Hispanic school. And a lot of my classmates were native Spanish speakers, either because they themselves had immigrated from Central or South America, or because their parents had. So a lot of my friends were native Spanish speakers. I wanted to learn to speak Spanish. So I took Spanish courses throughout middle school and high school. And by my junior year, I was in an AP Spanish course with a number of native Spanish speakers. And they were in the course not because they didn't know how to speak Spanish, they were fluent in oral Spanish, but they didn't feel as comfortable with formal written Spanish because they grew up speaking English in their schools, and so they never had an opportunity to write in formal settings. So I would struggle through these oral exercises in class. I'm still not very good at speaking Spanish orally, but I was doing pretty well in the written, assignments. And in preparation for taking the AP Spanish exam, we all took a different standardized test called the National Spanish Exam. And when we got the results back, they were very surprising, which is I, as a non-native Spanish speaker who couldn't speak Spanish well in oral exercises, had one of the highest scores in the region, higher than many of the native Spanish speakers in the class. And rather than patting myself on the back and saying, go me, I know Spanish better than everyone else in the class, I took it as a lesson that the test was deeply, deeply flawed. That if this was a test that was meant to measure fluency in Spanish or familiarity with the language, it had failed. And when I then asked what kinds of questions it was asking very formal versions of the language. It was asking about prepositions. It was asking about the imperfect subjunctive. I could do the imperfect subjunctive very well in a written test, but speaking really eluded me. I think that what happened on this Pew survey is somewhat similar. When we ask people about religion and religious knowledge in the US, we ask about a very formal elite version of the religious language that really measures, in this particular case, it measures familiarity with belief and doctrine. But it doesn't measure how well people are able to communicate with their co-religionists, with people in their own religious community. And it doesn't measure, it also, there's a separate set of questions then also about how much we know about the religious languages of other people. And so one way to illustrate that is to look at, so on this survey, one of the kinds of headlines that we saw is that Americans are religiously illiterate because they don't know this content knowledge. And so what I would encourage us to think about is to shift our thinking towards a different idea of understanding religious literacy. So the American Academy of Religion has defined religious literacy as the ability to discern and analyze the fundamental intersections of religion with social, political, and cultural life. So as you can see from this definition, this is not a content knowledge focused definition. To be religiously literate, in my mind, is not to memorize lists of facts about different religious traditions. And I think many of us can remember back to our textbooks, our high school textbooks, where if we did learn about religion, what we learned is often put in a little chart, and it has, you know, the founder of the tradition and the name of the house of worship and the name of the holy text and maybe, you know, a list of numbers, 5 pillars of Islam, the 4 noble truths, the Trinity. That type of religious literacy, that content knowledge focus of religious literacy, while we certainly recognize that it's important to have content knowledge, this definition of religious literacy focuses on skills. And it focuses on the skills that you need to be able to understand the intersection of religion with social, political, and cultural life. And so that type of religious literacy is one that we want to focus on. And in order to understand the intersection of religion with social, political, and cultural life, we don't want to focus on kinds of on aspects of religious identity that aren't as important in the daily lives of people. And so the kinds of questions that they were asking on this Pew survey focused on a lot of parts of identity that aren't necessarily as important to religious people. When Christians can't answer questions about Christianity correctly, then maybe we should think about whether those aspects of Christianity are actually important in their lived religious experience. So one way to think about it, again, to give you a concrete example, when I was doing my thesis, I was looking at a Catholic community in Providence, Rhode Island. And so I did my own sort of local study of the Catholic community. And then I was also drawing on studies from national studies about American Catholics. And often when we learn about Catholicism in the United States, we learn about it, if we are not Catholics ourselves, through the lens of these hot button issues. And these issues are ones that show up in the news a lot and that show up in the kinds of surveys that we just looked at. So these are issues about same-sex marriage, about the ordination of women, clerical celibacy, the use of birth control, or abortion, right? So I think many Americans would know that the American Catholic Church does not support same-sex marriage, that the church, the institution, does not support the ordination of women, does not support allowing priests to get married, have sex, and have children, does not support the use of birth control, and it does not support abortion. What's fascinating is if all we learned was a memorization of content knowledge about the elite version of the language about the American Catholic Church's stance on these issues, we would be very ill prepared to understand the American Catholic community, because the American Catholic community, the laity, the majorities of American Catholics take the opposite position from the American Catholic Church. So the majority of lay American Catholics support same-sex marriage. The majority of American Catholics support the ordination of women. They support the use of birth control, and a slim majority are pro-choice. So this hopefully helps us shift our thinking about what it means to be religiously literate. It's not necessarily memorizing these facts about the elite institutions. It's about trying to understand, why do people who self-identify as Catholic take these particular positions? It's more about the skills that we use to understand the intersection of American Catholics with American life, and the questions that we bring to the data. The last point, which I think is most interesting, even though it's least statistically significant, is about belief in God. So there was an international study that was conducted about the rise of atheism around the world. And they asked people at the beginning of the study to self-identify however they wanted. They could say, I'm Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu or Sikh or Baha'i or whatever it might be. Among those who self-identified as Catholic at the beginning of the survey, there was a measurable percentage, between 1% and 3%, who said that they did not believe in God when asked about their sort of theological beliefs. So here's something that we often think of sort of confessionally as central to what it means to be Catholic. That to be Catholic is to believe in God and believe that Jesus is the Son of God and believe something about the Trinity. Someone who's a part of a religious community or not part of a religious community, and someone who leads a religious community, might bring a certain confessional set of questions to this. They might ask, are those people Catholic or not? Or are they good or bad Catholics? So it's an evaluative question, right? Are they good or bad Catholics? Are they Catholics? Are they not Catholics? Someone with a religious studies hat doesn't find, it's just a different set of questions. It's not to say that those other questions aren't important. They just bring a different set of questions to the conversation. And the questions aren't evaluative, they're analytic. And they lead with questions like, what does it mean to be a Catholic in the United States? What does it mean to be a Catholic and not believe in God? What does it mean to be a Catholic and believe in God? What does it mean to be a Catholic and align with the Catholic Church's doctrine on these issues? What does it mean to not align? So it's asking why people self-identify the way that they do and what it then means for their lives, how it shapes their understanding of their place in social, political, and cultural life. So in the last part, I just want to give you a way of thinking about religious identity. And then we're going to take a little bit of time and use this to think about our own religious identities, and then we'll have a conversation about it. So just as we heard from one of our great attendees, there are people who think about religious identity in very complex ways. So I'm going to show you this belief, behavior, belonging framework that I've developed that is in the NCSS document that I mentioned earlier, but that is drawing on the scholarship of Grace Davy, of Jonathan Haidt, of other kinds of scholars who think about religious identity. And so one way that I want to think about religious identity today is that being religious isn't just about the things that we believe. Often when we think about religious identity, we use religion, belief, and faith as synonyms. We say that to be religious is to believe in something. We talk about religions as belief systems. We talk about interfaith dialogue. We talk about faith formation. We talk about in the government, when they work with religious communities, they talk about religious communities as FBOs, faith-based organizations. Religion, using these words interchangeably is really baked into a lot of American consciousness and how we talk about religion. A lot of religious studies research of the past century and more has tried to understand religion in a bit more of a complex way, that religious identity isn't just about the things that we believe, it's also about the ways that we behave and the communities that we belong to. So belief, we might think of that as the things that we easily identify as religious beliefs, our theologies, our doctrines, our sacred narratives, our holy texts. But it also includes the kinds of beliefs that we don't easily recognize as beliefs, our social values and ethics, even our political values. That there's a relationship, there's a conversation happening between those things we think of as religious per se, our religious beliefs, and other kinds of beliefs that we have are in conversation. Behaviors includes the things that we think of as easily as religious, our holy rites and rituals, right? So when we go to a mosque or church or synagogue or gurdwara or temple, whatever it might be, that there are certain kinds of rites and rituals that we might do there, or rites and rituals that we might do in our homes. But there's also other kinds of behaviors or habits, daily practices, things that we might not think of as religious per se, that are always in conversation with our other kinds of behaviors, the things that we do. And then finally, there's the communities that we belong to. So this long string of words on the slide is just meant to say that there's the community that we identify as our community of belonging when we say I'm Catholic or Hindu or Baha'i or Baptist or Methodist or Lutheran or Presbyterian, these religious communities of belonging. But then there's also the other communities that we belong to, our racial, ethnic, familial, gender, sexual, and other identities. And these kinds of communities of belonging are in conversation with one another. So we saw that earlier in the presentation when we were talking about race and religion, for example, that there's some kind of relationship in the United States, strong relationship that we see show up in voting patterns and how we worship in religious settings between religion and race, for example. So a way to diagram this is to look at belief, behavior, and belonging not in a new kind of way. So I think often many of us are trained implicitly or explicitly to think about religion as belief primarily, and that those beliefs shape our behaviors. So I, for example, might say I am a Christian who believes that Jesus is the Son of God, and therefore, based on that belief, based on my reading of the Bible and my belief in what the Beatitudes mean, I then behave charitably. That's one model of thinking about religious identity. what a lot of religious studies research has sought to illustrate over the past long time is that beliefs, behaviors, and communities of belonging are mutually constitutive. They're all shaping one another. They're all forming one another. So you see those arrows are going each way between belief, behavior, and belonging. That sometimes we believe certain things and that shapes our behaviors, but sometimes we behave in certain ways and those behaviors actually shape our beliefs. Or sometimes the communities that we belong to are shaping our beliefs. So for example, James Cone, who's considered the father of Black liberation theology in the United States, he wrote a landmark book called Black Theology of Liberation. And in that book, there's a section called the sources and norms of Black theology. And he says that in order to understand Black theology and how to do Black theology, that the first place we begin isn't with the Bible, it's not with belief in Jesus. He says the first place we begin is with the Black experience. That in order to understand what God means for Black people, we have to understand what it means to be Black in the United States and in the context of white racism when he's writing in the 60s and 70s. So that's just one example of how communities of belonging can shape our belief, or how behaviors can shape belief. I've spoken with many Buddhist practitioners who say that you don't believe something about Buddhism and then choose to behave a certain way. You actually start with seated meditation. You start with the practice, and through the practice, you come to understand certain truths. So I've also spoken with Catholic priests who say, if you're a lapsed Catholic and you're not sure that you believe in transubstantiation or communion, go to church and participate in the rites of the church. And it's through participation in those rites that you come to understand again for yourself what those beliefs mean and their significance. So this model, belief, behavior, belonging, is a model for thinking about the complexity of religious identity. So with the remainder of the time that we have, I want to leave 2-3 minutes for you to just think for yourself, how would you diagram your own religious identity? So there's a few things to keep in mind as you're diagramming it. And I'd encourage you, if you have a pen and paper or pencil and paper, to actually do this in front of you. One thing is to think about which beliefs, which behaviors, and which communities of belonging are most important to you. So you can write those down. You can sort of put those in 3 different parts of a paper. And then think about which is most important to you. Are your beliefs actually central to your religious identity, or is it your belonging, or is it your behavior? And so you can choose the size of the bubble to reflect how important that is to you. If belief is really important, maybe make that bubble really big. If belonging is really important, you can make that bubble really big. And then think about the arrows. So in your life, when you think about your own religious identity, do you think that your beliefs are shaping your behaviors? If that's the case, then draw an arrow, one-way arrow from belief to behavior. But if you think that your behavior is shaping your belief, or your belonging shapes your belief, then draw the arrows that way. So we'll do this exercise maybe two minutes or so. So at 55, whatever hour marker that is in your neck of the woods. And then we'll come back together and talk about it. I'll put this up here now so you can get examples of beliefs, behaviors, communities of belonging. Are there any questions about that activity? No? Great. Okay. So I'll come back to you in about 2 minutes. Question. So I see a request to put the questions in the chat box. So I'll just name some of those questions in the chat box here, if that's helpful. Thank you, Hannah. So we'll go for just one more minute. Okay, so does anyone want to share? If you don't feel comfortable, that's fine. But if you'd like to share what you wrote down or what you think, that I'd love to hear it.
I can go first to kick us off.
Thanks.
I guess I can try to all explain it a little better. So the smallest bubble on mine I put was for belief. And the largest bubble on here is behavior. And then the second largest is my community of belonging. I tried to put a lot of thought in what direction the arrows go.
Yeah.
And really, for me, I when I was reflecting on this, I found out that like my behavior really infected or impacted what community of belonging that I was a part of, but also realized that it was mutually influencing at the same time. So that was
great. Thank you so much. Thanks. Pamela? Yeah.
I believe that, let me see how I can get it in there. Can you hear at all?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, good. I went ahead and wrote in the chat room that I have a mixed background and was raised Catholic, but I think because of all the experiences of my life, I would put the behavior and belonging at the top, and belief system works between them. Because I'll still go to synagogue, and yet I'm an Episcopalian church member to honor my Jewish roots as well.
Yeah, I can understand that. My mom is Catholic and my dad is Jewish, so I was raised exposed to both communities, and so having language for trying to understand this relationship between these different parts of my religious identity has been helpful. What about anyone else want to share? I see Melinda just wrote something in the chat. Let me just read that.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Melinda. That's very that's meaningful. Thanks for sharing that. Great. So hopefully this was an interesting exercise to think about our religious identities. And in the last part of time that we have together, I want to talk about its relevance to interreligious engagement. So often when we do interreligious work, what are the models that you've seen for that? What does that look like in the past?
a lot of the times, so if you're referring to like interreligious like dialogue, and like interfaith dialogue, a lot of the times what I see is like interfaith dialogue, and I know that like Roger and I have discussed this, and you know, I think Katrina and I have discussed this. It just like a lot of times it just gets to be like really academic and stuffy about being like, well, this is what my set of beliefs are, and this is what your set of beliefs are, and this is how we're different. And then like you can shake hands afterward and be like, isn't it so great that we can get along? And like that's, at least that's some of what I've seen of interfaith dialogue. So that's one example.
Yeah. And that's what I've experienced a lot in the past as well, is that interfaith dialogue, even in its name, is assuming an investment by all of the interlocutors in belief as the primary part of religious identity. So there's this assumption that for everyone in the room, belief is the most important thing in their lives, and that that's what shapes for them what it means to be religious. And so what ends up happening sometimes is that the people in the room are having a conversation about belief when the people in the room aren't actually building the religious identities around their beliefs. So from the people we just heard from on the call today, some of you have said that belief isn't the primary, most important part of your religious identity, that behavior or belonging is most important. So when we do interreligious engagement or interreligious dialogue, it's something to be aware of, that when we're setting up the terms of the conversation, if you start the conversation by saying, let's talk about how, what our holy texts say about God, or let's see what they say about charity, some of the people in the room might not actually be most invested in having these theological conversations or doctrinal conversations. That might not be what's most important to them. What might be most important is the doing of certain kinds of rituals or activities, or it might be belonging, so experiences of growing up as a Baptist or Mormon or Hindu or Buddhist in Wyoming, what that experience is like, how that's shaped their lives. So what I would encourage you all to think about is, when you're doing interreligious work, that we think not just at the level of belief, but also behavior and belonging. And then what I would also say is this opens up new opportunities for seeing similarity and difference between religious communities. So when we only think about belief and we're focused on content, the content of that belief, we can hyperfixate on differences of language. So we can say, well, you talk about Jesus and I talk about Muhammad and you talk about, Krishna, whatever it might be, and let's look at the similarities and differences in those figures, or what we think about those figures. But if we take a step back and think about the construction of religious identity broadly and don't get so bogged down in the language that we use, we can see that actually, a Mormon and a Muslim and a Methodist all actually are constructing their religious identities the same way. They're all focusing most on behavior or belonging in their life. Even if they use different language to describe it, that's an area of similarity. And what we might actually see as well is that the two Methodists in the room might be using the same language of talking about being Methodist, but the ways that they construct their religious identities are different. There might be one Methodist in the room who's really belief focused, and another Methodist in the room who's really behavior focused. So that's something, that's what I hope this model brings to our conversations, is a different kind of richness to the conversation, a different richness to the ways that we talk about similarity and difference between and within religious communities. And then I see Mary bring up a great point. So developing a new ceremony on a sacred mountain in which Indigenous and Christian communities consider Indigenous wisdom regarding the land's power. Right, so this also hopefully brings up different ways of thinking about religion that are often obscured when we only use a Protestant Christian lens. So for much of history, Indigenous traditions have had a fraught relationship with the word religion because they don't always match up. The centrality of belief doesn't always match up in Indigenous or non-Christian communities in the way that it does in Protestant Christian communities. So hopefully this tradition helps us think about the richness of encounter between Indigenous and Christian communities, for example, in your state. Are there any questions about the model or its relevance to the work that you do? I know we're a little bit after the hour. If you need to run off, I totally understand, but I have a few extra minutes if you have any questions or comments.
Ben, just a quick thing. It's interesting to listen to folks describe kind of some of the mysticism of religion versus kind of the practicality of religion. Interfaith Alliance, we had a youth program for about 7 years where we would bring together as diverse a group of kids as we possibly could for a weekend of discussion around the history of religious liberty in America and practical things like Supreme Court cases. And almost every single one of the programs we did, at the end of the weekend, the kids would come away and go, gee, we seem to have so much more in common than we have difference. Mm-hmm. Sure, there's the mysticism of our faith tradition of prayer times and things like this, and where we worship and what we eat and what we drink. Mm-hmm. But that commonality of what their hopes and dreams were as individuals within their faith was kind of a universal, which was very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that this model is really helpful for showing that. So it helps us think back and forth between similarity and difference. What are the ways that we're similar in how we're constructing our religious identities? What is the difference of the language that we're using? So how do I talk about charity and how do you talk about charity? And what is what is the significance of those differences? So we can think back and forth between similarity and difference and not get, I think sometimes we can get over-invested in thinking about similarity or difference and saying whether we're all the same or we're all different.
Yeah.
That's where I see a lot of energy going, and I think it's more helpful to think about the complexity of both. It's sort of both.
Yeah, we had an interesting thing always on Friday nights where kids could put into a bowl questions about other faiths that a kid from that faith would respond to, and it was great to see what others might consider a quirk of our own religions from their perspective, of kids saying, so for Ramadan, you Muslims don't eat anything for a month? How does that work? Mm-hmm. And them explaining what Ramadan was, or, someone asking a Catholic, so you guys are cannibals, right? Because you believe that the wine turns into blood and the host turns into the body. And the Catholic is going like, I never thought of it like that. And it was just kind of the funny, humorous parts about taking that mysticism and kind of explaining it to what it means that was really entertaining and interesting and enlightening for the kids to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
Jordan, did you want to say something?
Yeah. I just said, so what I'm just going to get you to talk about a little bit about like your work with schools and kind of what you've been doing and with that. But so to set that up though, I mean, we've talked about like religious literacy and why it's important and its potential to combat attitudes that lead to bigotry and prejudice. And using the 3B framework to get to that religious literacy. What is the next step then with that? I mean, what are you advocating for that either schools do or that organizations like the Wyoming Interfaith Network should do to kind of advance some of the work that you've been talking about?
Yeah. So the education landscape in the United States is very decentralized. There's no one who can say, this is how it's going to be done, and then every school does it, which is strengths and challenges for those of us who care about religious literacy, for example. So there is, as I mentioned now, this mainstream national education organization called the National Council for the Social Studies that has guidelines for how we should be teaching about religion and actually advocates for the integration of religious studies into social studies education in the United States. But we've seen different responses to that document. Some states are really taking it up. Some districts are really excited about it and are aligning their curriculum to that, and some are not. Many of them just don't know about it. So one of the things that we advocate for is the integration of religious studies education into K-12 schools, especially that high school and middle school level. We recognize that many schools do not have the luxury to offer standalone religious studies courses in their schools. And so for those schools who are able to do that, great. But we think that religious studies can be integrated into the curriculum. It can be integrated into your US history or world history courses. It can be integrated into government courses. It can be integrated into literature courses. So there are different ways of integrating the study of religion into public schools so that students are able to understand the relationship between religion and social, political, and cultural life, as the AAR recommendations say. So we try to offer, we offer training and resources for educators, some for in-service educators, people who are already in the classroom. We offer training for teachers in the classroom who want to develop these skills. And we're trying to work with higher education institutions that train educators so that educators, when they're being trained to be teachers, are getting this kind of material as well. So it's, we try to do this in partnership with a lot of organizations, with higher education institutions, with schools, and with religious communities that are interested. So if any of you, thank you, Mary. If any of you are interested in continuing the conversation and thinking about schools in Wyoming, I'd be happy to have that conversation with you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for being here, for spending an hour together, more than an hour together. I really enjoyed my time with you. Like I said, this has been recorded, so I will send it to Jordan so that he can distribute it to your community. I'll also send a PDF of my slides. And I am available to any of you if you have any questions. I'll type my email address into the chat bar so that you have it. But I would love to have a conversation with you if that would be helpful. If you want to have a conversation like this with your specific religious communities, or you want to have a conversation about religion and education in Wyoming, whatever might be helpful for you.
Ben, could you also maybe put in the chat bar or send around later kind of a list of your favorite resource areas? I mean, you mentioned Pew, but PRI and some others. That's just really helpful.
Yeah, I think I'll send that in the email. It'll disappear here in a second if I do it here. But Pew, PRI, I also give a plug that the Religious Freedom Center, we have a resources page that is full of different kinds of readings and materials. So if you just go to religiousfreedomcenter.org, there's a resources page with a lot of great material there.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. All right, well, thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope we have the chance to speak again. And thanks to Jordan for organizing this. I'm really grateful.
Yeah. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, thanks.